Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to take a look at a very interesting group that's involved in helping to inform Americans about many international issues and the legal, logical, and practical role of the United Nations in dealing with these international issues that in many cases impact our lives every day. My guest today is with the United Nations Association of the United States of America. Mr. Troy Wolfe is the Senior Director of the United Nations Association of the USA's Education, Programs, and Learning.
Yes.
Troy Wolfe, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. Glad to be here.
Good to see you. I haven't seen you for 5-6 years. It's been a while.
It's been a minute.
That's right, New York minute, right.
Yeah.
Well, great. I'm glad you're here. Let's start off with a very basic question. What is the United Nations Association of the USA? When was it formed? Why was it formed? What does it do?
So UNA USA is a grassroots movement of Americans who support the ideals and principles of the United Nations, and we do that through grassroots advocacy. We were started more than 70 years ago by our champion, Eleanor Roosevelt, when she set out to go on college campuses and engage young people in calls to advocate for the world that they want. That mission continues. It's in our DNA. We re-upped efforts some years back to go out and recruit younger people, and our network is growing.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yes,
That's
yes.
very good, right. And our viewers can go to your website at www.unausa.org and get more information.
That's correct.
Right. And full disclosure, I've been involved off and on with the United Nations Association for the past 100 years or so, not quite that long. But anyway, it's a great organization to help people understand these issues and to take an objective look at the United Nations to see what role it can play, see what its strengths are, what its weaknesses are, and to be really a constructive critic of the United Nations to help it do a better job, because it's the only multilateral international organization that brings the countries of the world together.
Yes, yes. We like to say that the UN is not a perfect place, but I think we all coalesce around the ideal that we think that the world is a better place because it does exist. And when you think about why the UN was created, it was created to prevent World War III. And on that premise alone, so far, we have not had World War III. And we like to say, as long as nations are speaking to each other, they're not fighting with each other.
It's absolutely important to have dialogue, to have communication, because if you don't, you have problems like wars, and it happens.
And misunderstandings.
Exactly,
Yes.
That's exactly right. Well, now you're part of a couple of larger organizations. There's the United Nations Foundation that was set up by Ted Turner, I think in 1998, along in there. What is your relationship, UNA USA's relationship with the UN Foundation?
Very good question. So, yes, Ted Turner is the founder of the United Nations Foundation, which was created in 1998 when he was upset that the United States had not paid their dues to the UN. As you're aware, all member states pay dues. So he did what I guess a billionaire can do, checkbook in hand, went to the UN to make a contribution. UN could not do it, and so he rallied his colleagues at the UN Association and created the UN Foundation. We merged with them in 2009, and we are one of the programs. We call ourselves the grassroots program of the UN Foundation. There are other retail programs, as we call them, retail in the sense that they are extremely popular and mainstream. We have Shot at Life, which talks about immunizations. We have Girl Up, which talks about empowering young women and girls, and Nothing But Nets, which addresses the issue of malaria and mosquito-borne disease.
And we've talked about how important it is not only for people in the United States to learn more about the UN, but also people around the world. And you're part of another group called WFUNA.
That's correct.
The World Federation of the United Nations Associations. What basically is that group about?
So UNA USA is part of WFUNA. There are WFUNAs all over the world. And depending on how they are set up, some can be NGOs, some can be auxiliary parts of a government. It just kind of depends. I would dare say by far, though, the network that we have here in the United States of about 20,000 members, more than 200 chapters, is by far the largest WFUNA organization that's set up.
Right. And so our viewers can go to WFUNA.org to get information on that.
That's correct.
Well, you've got so many activities underway. It's just been mind-boggling when I think back 20, 30 years ago, when I got 40 years ago now, got involved with the United Nations Association. We had a lot of activities, but I think they've accelerated, they've improved, they've become more substantive over the years. But let's start talking about a little bit, how has UNA USA changed what we're looking at today in 2020 as opposed maybe to when you came on board as a staff member?
So it's changed in many ways, just like the world has changed. I think UNA USA historically was a think tank. In an era of social media, we are certainly not that anymore. We do provide briefing notes and other things, but we are an activist organization. We strategically use social media to message opportunities to our members. We're big on toolkits, we're big on webinars, we're big on, there's a feature out there called Text to Advocate. You know, we're an advocacy-based organization, and so we have this mechanism in real time at some of our large-scale events where we're able to call on our members. They pull out their phones at a certain point, they text a message to their representative. We really are looking at empowering our grassroots network to localize the Sustainable Development Goals in ways that matter to their communities. From the national office, which is where I work, we have 2 locations. The UNF headquarters is in Washington, D.C. There's a much smaller operation here in New York City, right across the street from the United Nations. But we're really empowering our membership base to localize the Sustainable Development Goals. And one would ask, well, what does that look like, or what could that look like? We use New York City as an example. New York City did something called a voluntary local review, where they looked at objectively the goals of the city, and they took those indicators and they mapped them to the goals and objectives of the Sustainable Development Goals. The 169 targets, 232 indicators. New York strategically looked at all of those and said, you know, where are we trying to take this city? And we would love it if our members and our chapters across the country use that as a model to kind of replicate what New York did in a local context.
And that's a good example of how the Sustainable Development Goals that they're on a 15-year continuum, came online in 2016 to 2030, and these were goals adopted by all 193 countries at the United Nations to eradicate poverty, to eliminate hunger, to empower women, to promote gender equality, equity, that type of thing, to combat climate change. And people think, well, those are nice goals, but they don't really apply to us in the United States or in Germany or Britain or Japan or Thailand, wherever it might be, but they do. And this is a good way to take those really 17 goals, as you mentioned, and all the sub-goals or targets, the 169 of them, and focus on them to show how they're impacted and how we all have a role to play to achieve these goals and to create a better society.
Absolutely. 193 member states, including the United States, signed aboard to achieve those goals. And if you do the math, I think they expire or they mature
Right.
in January
December 31st, 2030?
Right.
Okay.
Which works out to be like 9,000 plus some days. And when you think about the decade of action really is the next 10 years, and how are we going to localize? What conversations need to take place out in civil society so that our members and civil society, anyone out there, can be empowered to realize that the work of the UN is not about someone else doing it. The work of the UN, all of us have to come to the table and make a contribution. The expression is not everyone can do everything, but everyone can do something. And so we're really encouraging our members to amplify and engage the full community in ideals that lather up to supporting the Sustainable Development Goals. To that point, we're encouraging our members to look at the questions that the Secretary General has put out. There are 3 questions, and we're asking our members to do consultations around these 3 questions. What do you want the future to look like? Are we on board to achieve that vision? If we're not, what needs to happen in order to do that? And when you think about those questions, they're very basic, but it's the devil in the details. You know, the how is the same how and the devil in the details of the Sustainable Development Goals. All voices need to be represented at the table. And so we just look at it as a wonderful opportunity to bring civil society to the conversation and really make global change.
It's absolutely crucial that we do that. We've got to do it, we've got to focus on it. Now you remember, I mentioned the Decade of Action. This was developed by Secretary General Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, and that's going to be for the next 10 years, is that correct?
That's correct.
This is going to be it.
That's correct.
When in 2030, we're going to hopefully achieve most of these goals.
That's the plan. That is the plan. And I think, you know, again, back to the just calling it the Decade of Action, it's time to move away from academic conversations or move away from things that cannot be measured, and to really get granular in figuring out what specifically can our community do. And it might be different answers in different communities. We should expect that. I'll give an example. We have a fantastic chapter out in Marin County, California. Sure. And I was out there for UN Day every year. The UN Foundation, we all travel all over the country. We go support chapters on October 24th in celebration of the UN Charter, the signing of the Charter. And I had 5 visits, and one of them was in Marin County. And one of our members there has developed a database, and it's called Systems Thinking Marin. and she walks us through a process of what it means to really begin to identify partners in a community and all the things that one has to think through. Do the objectives of this partner align with ours? How do you begin the conversation? How do you follow through on credibility? Because we are a volunteer organization. Most of our members, there are very few UNA USAs that are 501c3s that have full-time staff. The majority are just great people who care about the world, care about the planet, and they find time to commit to this. So when we talk about developing partnerships to achieve the goals, there has to be a degree of follow-through. And so the Systems Thinking Marin is just a fantastic database and resource which kind of walks you through the process of all the things that one has to think about to form a partnership, and then it gets granular and very specific to the needs and ideals of Marin County.
Now you mentioned, I'm glad you brought that up, a 501c3 organization. You're also a membership organization. Our viewers can go to your website, unausa.org, and go /join and become a member if they'd like to. And
that is correct. And membership for anyone under the age of 25 is free.
You can't beat the price.
you certainly can.
You can't beat it.
You certainly
sure.
can. And I think the free membership came about, some years back we looked at our membership base. We have a very rich history, but we looked at our membership base and we realized that if we didn't recommit to the vision of our founder, Eleanor Roosevelt, by going back on college campuses, engaging young people, that we might not be around in another 10 years. And so we really did some outreach, strategic outreach on college campuses. Excuse me, we really did outreach with Model UN programs. You're familiar with Model UN, the simulation of the United Nations, where students role play. And so we looked at our touch points with the high school Model UNers, the collegiate Model UNers, and we realized that while this is a simulation, make-believe, that the preparation that these young people need in order to participate successfully in Model UN is real. When they talk about climate change, when they talk about gender parity in a simulation, the skills and the knowledge that they have on that subject matter is real. And so what better way to provide a national platform to engage these young people and to give them voice than for them to join for free with UNA USA.
It's a perfect opportunity. It's a win-win situation. And again, it's so important that we be apprised of these issues because these events do impact our lives. We think, what's happening over in Syria, who cares? Well, we do. We should care because it will impact us here. Climate change. We can see that climate change is roaring. It's moving on steroids almost, unfortunately. So we have these issues that we have to deal with, and we have to deal with them now.
Absolutely.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a community access television or PBS station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a computer, you have a website, you like our programs, and you'd like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're taking a look at a very unique organization, a very interesting organization, the United Nations Association of the United States of America. My guest today is an expert on this, along with all of the international issues. My guest today is Mr. Troy Wolfe. Troy Wolfe is the Senior Director of the UNA USA Education Programs and Learning. Troy, we're talking about the United Nations, and a minute ago you were talking about how it's not a perfect organization. I think everybody's in agreement on that. Anytime you bring 193 governments together, now there's a recipe for disagreement, but it's amazing how much they actually agree upon. When you look at the General Assembly with the resolutions that come out of there, you look at the Security Council, the most powerful of the 6 organs of the United Nations, and how the Security Council from 1945 really until about 1989, we fought the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the U.S. each took their partners and buddies and went in different directions and blocked each other in the Security Council. But there's been a tremendous amount of cooperation in those two bodies, just as examples, as opposed to what it was during the early days of the United Nations.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think, Bill, social media, the advent of social media, sharing things in real time, everyone having a voice, everyone being an author, everyone being a publisher, has drastically changed the world. And I think when we think about, I'll go back to those 3 questions, are we on board to achieve the world that we want, and what role does the United Nations have in that? I think the United Nations itself is also questioning, it's questioning itself to be relevant in this changing dynamic, in this changing sphere. everyone has a voice and an opinion on what's taking place in the world. And that's a new paradigm for the United Nations, but exciting times. And I think nations will continue to figure out how to be just. I think nations will continue to figure out how to be collaborative. I think there's a role for NGOs, for civil society, for everyone to influence those narratives and to be more transparent, which I think is really the goal of what the UN is working towards. And I think we saw that when the last Secretary General came on board. It was the first time where we were really messaging out as much information as we could about the onboarding of the next Secretary General. And so we're moving in the direction of global sharing.
Right. And when you think back to the 80s and 90s, along there, transparency, accountability really weren't terms that were in the lexicon at the United Nations, but they are today. The role of the non-governmental organizations, Rotary International, Lions International, faith-based groups,
yes.
Optimists, just on across the board, they're very actively involved at the United Nations, along with the private sector. The private sector has a tremendous role to play, especially in combating climate change, eliminating poverty, and they're really at the table today to a large degree, are they not?
Absolutely, absolutely. To that point, so UNAUSA has a national council. The national council is not our board of directors, but it's the easiest way for me to describe it in the time that we have. It's a representation of about 40 individuals who are UNAUSA members who come from geographically dispersed regions making up the United States. We meet a couple of times a year. And we kind of discuss the priorities of UNAUSA as a network.
Which is extremely important.
Very much so.
Very important.
And so through that National Council, our chair, Tita Banks, Honorable Tita Banks, last year put together a Partnerships and Collaborations Committee, of which I'm the staff lead on. And to your point, to make sure that we do achieve these goals and to engage the private sector, we are vigilant in our outreach to businesses to bring them on board so that they can really begin to identify with the Sustainable Development Goals and realize that they too have a responsibility in making sure that we achieve them.
Now, as we all know, following the United Nations over the years, there's a lot of misinformation out in the general public. A lot of people think that the United Nations is a one world government, which it's not. They think the United Nations is just flush with cash, loaded with money, which it's not. It's cutting the budget, what have you. How do you address these concerns, some of these tidbits of misinformation when people say the UN, it's a challenge, I know. You wouldn't believe, if you listen to some of the radio talk show people, you wonder what planet they're living on. But anyway, that's another story. But how do you deal with this when you say that, the UN is not perfect, but it's important because of burden sharing? It's not a wealthy organization. We need to contribute to peacekeeping. It's in our best interest to do that. How do you work on that?
I would say that it calls on the highest sense of diplomacy first.
Without a doubt.
I personally like to say that there's 17 goals, and I'm not looking for a fight in any of them. And so I think, I go back to what I said earlier, if nations are speaking to each other, if people are speaking to each other, they're not fighting. And through conversations, you can raise one's understanding. And so I'll give you an example. So there was one year I was in Westchester for a UN Day event, right, October 24th. And there was a father and son. The son was participating. He was there to play a musical instrument as part of the program. And I had an opportunity to have a side conversation with the father. The father was not a fan of the UN, but he allowed his son to come. And that, to me, was a win and a victory. He didn't prevent his son from being there. And I think through small conversations, we're able to onboard people and kind of dispel some of the misunderstandings of the UN. And to that point, because the UN has been kind of shrouded in secrecy for some years, I think the more transparent the UN is, people can begin to identify, wow, the UN is not them doing this. The UN is all of us working collaboratively. The UN is all of us really developing a much broader understanding of me seeing the humanity in you, even though it might not affect me, and figuring out that we all have a responsibility in addressing some of these global challenges.
I have been involved with UNAUSA for years, also with Rotary International for many years now, and have done programs on Rotary in the United Nations. Rotary was in the forefront of creating the United Nations in 1945 in San Francisco, California. There were other groups too, but Rotary was right up there, right at the beginning of the line, so to speak. And Rotary and the UN have had a unique relationship, a public-private public-private partnership. And they've worked on programs, educational programs, clean water programs, the Polio Plus program, which is the largest international health program ever undertaken, and it's still going on to eliminate the scourge of polio. And inevitably, when you talk to Rotarians, I'm sure you've encountered this too, inevitably somebody or a couple of them might say, well, I don't really like the UN, the UN does this, does that. But after a presentation, these people change their minds. They, in most cases, and most people say, I didn't know the UN did that.
Yeah.
I didn't know the UN affected my life by helping to move aircraft, ships, mail, weather information internationally, combating diseases like the coronavirus, that type of thing.
Yes.
But you run into that every day,
yes.
do you not?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's those stories that begin to allow people to recalibrate their understanding of the contributions that the UN has made. Absolutely.
I think you're absolutely right.
You brought up Rotarians. We would love to have a partnership with them. I know you're affiliated. I also read you're a former Peace Corps volunteer.
Yes.
As I am. Yeah.
Very good.
Yes, yes.
That's right. Well, in fact, the returned Peace Corps volunteers and Peace Corps has official MOU with the United Nations, and Rotary does too now.
Yes.
So there's movement in the right direction, and there are other groups too. We're certainly not the only ones.
Yeah.
Well, what other groups, other activities would you like to discuss? We're down to about 3 minutes.
Okay.
And what have we left out?
So we have many marquee moments throughout the year, but I have to bring up we have two very large annual events. We have the Global Engagement Summit, which takes place either in February or in March every year at the UN headquarters. It is an opportunity for us to invite all of our members. We usually fill up the General Assembly Hall. We invite our members and they hear from high-level officials about the going-ons at the UN. Last year, the Secretary General himself came. He walked into the audience and was taking selfies as he exited, so it was pretty phenomenal. You can't get any bigger in our world than the Secretary General and selfies.
That's right.
The other marquee moment takes place at the beginning of June. This year, it is June 7th, 8th, and 9th. It is in Washington, D.C., and it's called the Leadership Summit. The Leadership Summit is a 3-day event. The first day event is an opportunity for us to train our grassroots advocates, how to use social media, what's the landscape, to empower them so they can be champions in their communities when they go back to wherever they live. The second day is about the status and the relationship of what's going on with U.S.-UN relations. And the third day we go stomp the hill, and we meet with our elected officials, and we show up asking for many things, but the first ask is for full funding for the United Nations. The UN would not be able to do its work without the contributions from its member states, the United States included. It is one of the most, if not the most powerful thing that we do as a network. There is no other group of people who are going up on Capitol Hill in blue UN t-shirts asking for full funding. And
it's important to realize too, and you know it, and most folks around here know it, but the U.S. pays its fair share to the United Nations. We're only paying 22%, 22 cents on the dollar, and that's just for the general budget. And then I think peacekeeping was at 25, 26, but even that may have been reduced, I'm not sure. But it also is a shock to a lot of people to find out that the United States actually benefits as much or more than most countries that are part of the United Nations, the other 192 countries. And so it's certainly in our best interest to do this. Now, we're almost about out of time. We won't have time for the URL. We'll put the URL, we'll put it at the bottom.
Okay.
But you have a briefing book on dealing with a lot of the misconceptions and how the UN actually impacts our lives. Can they find that on your website? Or?
That is correct. They will be able to find a link on the website. It is the briefing book, and if I could just give you the title of that real quickly, just so that someone can search if they need to.
And we'll put that long URL at the bottom here.
That's correct. It's called Partners in Progress, the U.S. and the UN in 2020, Congressional Briefing Book.
And that will deal with all the issues we've been talking about today and many that we never got to. But in the last 10 seconds we have, what do you think is our biggest challenge as we move forward?
I think engaging all of civil society in the conversation and just realizing that the power starts with us. I think that young people are kind of demonstrating that they have a new voice. They're eager to participate in making sure that we provide pathways for that voice to be at the table.
And young people they care about these issues. They're very concerned about climate change, and they should be, because this planet may be uninhabitable. If we continue on our current trajectory, it will be uninhabitable, and we have to, and they're willing to get involved. And of course, UNA USA provides a platform. It's a nonpartisan, or bipartisan, I should say, approach to dealing with these international issues. You're a 501c3 organization, and everyone is welcome to participate, to join, and to be involved. And so we mentioned earlier, the United Nations is not perfect, but as Madeleine Albright, the former ambassador to the UN and former Secretary of State, said, it is, quote, indispensable, unquote. And it does. And really, if we didn't have the UN today with all of its warts and imperfections, we would have to create it tomorrow. But Troy Wolfe, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you.
Good to see you, and thank you
well.
so much. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.